morning. When our children were younger, we took a road trip every year with our tent trailer. And one of our traditions was that we would try and make sure that somewhere in our trip, we would stop in a city where there was a Major League Baseball game, because our boys and I enjoyed going. One year we found ourselves in Denver. There was an afternoon game to attend, and it was perfect. Sunny, warm, an absolutely gorgeous ballpark, no trouble finding the place. But the best tickets we could get were in the third deck. If you like modern ballparks, it was a perfect seat, a panoramic view of the area around the stadium itself. But if you were there to watch the game, it was a bit like watching ants on the ground. And in about the second inning, they ran a promotion. Promotion they often run at games. Often it's called the move of the game. 2 fans are selected at random, and in this game, it was the 2 fans sitting right in front of us who were selected to be moved from the worst seats in the house to the ultra-prime seats in the first row of box seats behind the first base dugouts. The winners in front of us, were they ever excited? So were we, because we were on the Jumbotron when they stood up to celebrate. And they were celebrating, they were showing on the Jumbotron the before part of the promotion, where they were sitting and the view they had of the ants on the ground. A half inning later, they came on the Jumbotron again, this time being ushered into their very special seats, with a view of what it looked like from there. And man, was it different. It was staggering what an upgrade it was. And they were excited, jumping up and down, high-fiving each other, marveling at their good fortune. But what amazed me, though, was the reaction of the people around them in the ultra-prime seats. The utter indifference of the new neighbors was astonishing to me. They didn't seem to care about the good fortune that had befallen this couple. So the couple who experienced the move of the game quickly settled down and just watched the proceedings. The story that Carl read earlier, the story of the Prodigal Son, is a story about a real-life move of the game. The youngest son was on the outs, having abandoned his family. He was out of money. He had the lowest level, most unpleasant, probably lower than minimum wage job that you could get, and he was desperate. He didn't know how he was going to survive. He was even farther away than the third deck seats in life. And to make it even more dramatic, he was there by his own choice. He had previously been an honored member of his father's household. He once sat in the most prime front row seats of life, with all the services and accoutrements he could possibly imagine. And he gave it up. He demanded his share and abandoned his family. And now look at him, disgraced, displaced, and in despair. So he says to himself, I wonder if I can go back. And he tries. What is there to lose? And he must have been completely shocked at what happened. His father running out to greet him, the special coat, a party, a feast, looked after by servants, celebrations, and a full return to his status as an honored member of the household. And he received the gift that was offered. He didn't have to measure up. He just needed to accept it. Now that is a move of the game. And then we hear about the older brother. I imagine him a bit like those people who already had prime seats that afternoon in Denver. Here was this cast out from the nether regions of the world showing up in his space. And what should he make of it? Unlike the fans in Denver that day, he was far more than indifferent. He's bothered. And he's angry. And basically he says, it's not fair. He yells that at his father. Because the older brother was thinking about the choices that he had made. He had been loyal. He had been honorable. He was proud of himself and proud of his choices. And he resented his brother for his return from poverty to privilege. In his own mind, the older brother embodied what it meant to be really special. And the younger brother was nothing more than a freeloader. The older brother was expecting something exclusive, some kind of exclusive privilege for his virtue. And his younger brother no longer measured up. It wasn't right that he be allowed back into the elite company of the household. On hearing this very familiar story again, something struck me like it hasn't before. For me, a very important part of the story has not yet been told. It's left to our imaginations to wonder about what might have happened after the part that we read. Did the younger brother truly return to the fold? Change his ways, stay loyal, pull his own weight? And what about the older brother? Did he stay grumpy and resentful? Did he ghost his brother? Did he take his father's advice to join in the celebration of the return of the lost one? And that's the untold part of the story. So what is the rest of the story? And that's actually a question that we all need to think about. We're each eligible for our own move of the game in a spiritual sense. When we say yes to Jesus, we go from lost to found. We go from mired in sin to saved by grace. We go from being resident of earth to hallowed child of God. That's quite a move, far more significant than from the third deck to the box seats. In fact, it's an awful lot like the experience that the younger son had when he was welcomed by his father. And we each need to think about this. Having arrived at that very blessed station in life where we are welcomed by the Father, what will the rest of the story be? And we have 3 texts to help us work on that answer, and each text provides us with a different lesson. The first lesson comes from Joshua chapter 5, obviously an Old Testament story, and it follows on from the story Pastor Carl told us a number of weeks ago when we talked about moving from security to generosity. He told the story of the Israelites who had been freed from exile in Egypt. They followed God, and just when they thought that they had been abandoned and were about to starve to death, he provided manna for them. They had enough for every day. And if they tried to create security for themselves by saving up a little bit for the next day, anything that they tried to save would go bad. And each day God would provide again. Fresh manna, enough for that day. So the pattern that we've talked about, where there was a before reality, in this case they were in exile in Egypt, follows because they were then moved to an after reality, which they realized as God led them from Egypt, parting the Red Sea, the time in the desert, and ultimately the new land that he had promised them. And unlike the desperate before days, the after days was a time when they were free, chosen by God, guided and protected by him, and every day there was manna. After was a very blessed place. And what's the rest of the story? Well, once they settled into the after in the promised land, guess what? The manna stopped. The exclusive provisions that they had been provided came to an end. The rest of the story was that having landed in Canaan, the promised land, they were expected to mix and to mingle in their new land. They ate from the crops of the land, and they became integrated into that place. There was no more special treatment. They became part of their new home. Lesson number 2 comes from the 32nd Psalm, the Song of David, a song in which he describes the joy of forgiveness. You might say that he was describing his spiritual move of the game. He begins by describing his before. He's groaning, his body wasting away, his strength is dried up. It's not a happy place. And then his life changes because he acknowledges his sin. He confesses his transgressions, and he feels the gift of God forgiving the guilt of sin. And that starts his after. Listen to how different after is for David. He says, "At the time of distress, the rush of mighty waters shall not reach me. You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with glad cries of deliverance." God's love steadfastly surrounds him. And David's account of this change in his life isn't done. He goes on to talk about the rest of the story. The rest of the story is that after is not just a place to enjoy refuge and the privilege of grace. It's a place where we need to be open to instruction and teachings from God on the way that we should go. God will counsel us. In fact, we are told not to be like a wild horse or a stubborn mule whose temper must be curbed with a bit or with a bridle. Kind of reminded me of the older brother who sounded like a bit of a wild horse or stubborn mule whose temper got the best of him. The rest of the story is that we should expect to be taught and shaped by God so that we will go where he would have us go. The third lesson comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. In this passage spends less time talking about the before and the after, and it spends much more time talking about the rest of the story. The pattern is clear, though. There is a before and there is an after. Paul says that once we are in Christ, we are a new creation. The old has passed away and everything has become new. That is our after. And then he goes on to answer the question, so what? What does it matter to be a new creation? And then comes the rest of the story. He eloquently describes how we are called to two duties. First, he gives us the ministry of reconciliation. What does that mean? Well, if you consult a dictionary, you'll see that reconciliation is described as winning over with friendliness, settling a dispute or a quarrel, bringing things into agreement or harmony, or reconsecrating something that has been desecrated. All of those things, I think, are part of our ministry of reconciliation. My simple definition of reconciliation is that we are called to God's work of putting things right the way they ought to be. And the second duty that we are called to is that we are called to be ambassadors of Christ. God makes his appeal to others through us. We are his representatives. We carry his message. Our words and actions must be worthy of the one whom we represent. That is the rest of the story. And as we each experience God's grace, moving from our own personal before to the after, we experience a place where we are loved and cared for, and a place where we are expected to do something. We are to be ministers of reconciliation and ambassadors for Christ. Imagine if that's how we described ourselves. Someone asks you, "What do you do?" And you say, or you hand them your business card, and it says, Minister of Reconciliation and Ambassador for Christ. So let's pull together these three lessons that we've learned about the rest of the story. Like the Israelites, we are expected to mix and mingle with the residents of our promised land. Standing off to the side, awaiting the daily provision of manna, that's not an option. We are to get involved to be inclusive, and to share the bounty of the land. From David, we learn that we should expect to receive training and instruction, to be shaped for God's purposes, so that we can be steadfast in him and not stubborn like a mule. And from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we see that we are to be ministers of reconciliation, bringing people together, repairing ruptured situations, and helping to set things right. And we are ambassadors for Christ, embodying the essence of the divine one whom we represent. Remember at the beginning we talked about the older brother of the prodigal son? He expected privilege and special treatment for his virtue. He grew angry when he saw his privilege shared with someone who had experienced the spiritual move of the game. And we asked, what would the rest of the story be? Imagine if the father's words sunk in. Imagine if the older brother was able to see the joy of the occasion, of his brother's return from before to after. What do you think the family would look like if the older brother moved from privilege to inclusion? What do you think the family would look like if he moved beyond temper tantrums to seeking the instruction of God? If he moved from guarding the family's reputation and status to being a minister of reconciliation and an ambassador for Christ? How different would the older brother's life look if he took up the rest of the story? And that is a question we all face. Will we embrace the rest of the story? It's so easy and so natural to grow comfortable with the glorious state of being blessed by God, to want to relish in how magnificent it feels to have been found and to be folded into the arms of Jesus. That is such a wonderful place to be. In fact, we celebrate that place every week here together. And it is so easy to create our own little fenced-off spiritual world around it. I vividly recall an incident from my youth. On a cold, wintry Sunday morning during a service, a disheveled, seriously underdressed man walked into the small lobby of the church that I grew up in. For some odd reason, I happened to be in the lobby at that time. When one of the ushers left the sanctuary to go into the lobby to speak to the man. And this usher was a man of deep faith who was preoccupied with the reverence and the seriousness of this place of worship. He had a reverence for what he believed. He had a reverence for what he believed should be shown during a service. And he was likely concerned about avoiding some kind of disturbance. So he approached the man and he said, "This is a church. It's not a place to warm up." Remaining exclusively in the safety of God's arms, enjoying that place by ourselves, is not what we are created for. God's plan is not about you alone. It's not about me alone. Our greatest fulfillment comes when we are open to the rest of the story, and we share bountifully that gift of God's grace. Our greatest joy comes from welcoming others as they receive that same gift. It's a gift that is not for hoarding, and it's a gift that's not for keeping to ourselves. We are ambassadors. We are ministers of reconciliation. We are to help get things as they ought to be. So the next time that you're inclined to think, "I'm good just where I am," or "I'll trust God and watch what happens," or "This situation, it's not for me," or "I think I'll step back and sit this one out," or "I'm above this situation," or "I don't think I need to address this particular challenge in this relationship." The next time any one of us is inclined to think about those things, Think about the ministry of reconciliation and Christ, whose ambassador we are. And then that would be a really good time for each of us to ask, what will be the rest of our story?
Thank you for listening to this message from Fort Garry MB Church. We hope that what you heard challenged you to think in new ways about Jesus Christ and the life that we are called to through his death and resurrection. If you have any questions about who we are as a church, our mission, or have any other questions in general, please do not hesitate to contact our office email at info@fgmb.ca. Be blessed.